All right, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and be connected with you. I'm Engi Jaber, and I'll be moderating this futuristic yet historical concept. So let's start with an interesting fact and why floating cities, from a design and engineering perspective, is actually needs to be, we need to pay more attention to the details. So to start with, did you know that around 40% of the population actually lives around the coast or within 100 kilometers from a coastline? And that is a key fact because considering the climate change, we are looking at around 340 million people who are looking to be displaced in the next 20, 30 years. So if we don't start, engineering right and looking at future-ready, resilient infrastructures, that means that we are just increasing the vulnerability of that population, plus any development that we're trying to, set forth as a new city or a new community. All those new giga projects that you're hearing that are, taking place on the sea because of this expansion. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists of the day. Perhaps you guys could give a brief brief introduction about yourselves.
Thank you very much for the introduction. This is Khalid Al-Shama. I am a co-founder for XYZ Designers. We are architecture and urban planning, master planning consultancy. And it's a great pleasure to be part of this hot topic. And I salute the intro about people would love to sit next to the water. So this is why I think we're discussing, all of us, the floating cities. Thank you.
Roland Schein. I'm the operations manager for GHD, but in my previous role in the same company, I was the head of the environmental science division of UAE operations, and we are especially focused in marine sciences. So obviously very excited to be here and talk on the potential environmental impacts and opportunities that floating cities bring. So thank you for having us here.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. I'm hoping as a part of the panel discussion, and by end of the panel discussion, we have some more energy in the room. I'm Dr. Harpreet Seth. I head the program of architecture at Heriot University here in Dubai. And I've really seen Dubai because, like maybe some of us, quite a few of us, I've been in Dubai for more than 32 years. And I'm an architect, urban designer by profession. Thank you.
I'm Cameron. I'm here with the Floating Institute. I chair the Policy and Governance Committee. I'm an ex-seafarer. I was at sea for about 14 years before swapping over and becoming a maritime lawyer and focus mostly on maritime law, policy, governance and regulation. And the Floating Institute's role is to sort of evangelise and seed the market to floating infrastructure, and we take a consultative and advisory role to innovation in that space.
Great, pleasure to meet all of you. So let's kick our discussion up. First of all, a question to the audience before I come to you guys. If you would throw in a timeline, who says that floating cities as a concept came up within the past, let's say, 10 years? Takers? 20 years? 30 years? 40? 50? 100? 200? Anyone would like to give any higher number? Let's say, I feel like I'm in a bid. All right, going once. 200? 300? No? Okay, no takers. It's actually 4,000 years ago. So it actually started back during the Inca civilization. That is when the first floating settlement, it wasn't a city, but it was a settlement, that still stands today with 1,200 people. and they're called the people of Oros. I don't know if you know them, but they're in Peru. At Lake Titicaca, I think was it, or yeah. And basically, they've migrated into those floating structures that they've created from native plants, like the reeds, that they put on top of buoyant floating structures. And they've done that because they wanted to avoid conflict with the Incas people. At the time, there were a lot of conflicts, lots of war, so they just decided to run away and have their own settlement away from all the mess that was happening around them, to live more peacefully. And ever since then, till date, they actually replace any plants or reeds that actually decay with newer reeds and materials, so that, and it's all inspired from the local structures. They use boats for mobilization and connectivity between one another. And they've found that this has been working for them for thousands of years. And that is what inspired the concept of floating cities, that instead of, as Paul has correctly said, rather than, we're limited on land, so if we are going to go to the sea, is it worthy of, man-made islands, reclaimed lands, or do we actually have floating structures that are more sustainable? But are they more sustainable? Do they offer an alternative solution to our conventional reclaimed lands? And this is where I'd like to start our conversation. So, Dr. Harpreet, from your point of view, where do you see the benefits of floating cities? Do they actually pose as a viable solution? Is it sustainable? Please share your thoughts.
Hey, thank you. I think first of all, we need to start this morning with acknowledging the fact that our planet is really at a tipping point. We have all these ideas, concepts, and conversations, but maybe it is really time to take action. It's very, very important that we learn to work with nature. What man has essentially done, and why even are we having a conversation on man-made islands, is because, of course, we live in a city which does have man-made islands, and they're very successful. My husband works on one of these is working on one of these man-made islands, but the bigger question is, how long is man going to just want to claim and conquer? There's a huge mistake that probably we are making, and we're seeing the impact of that on human beings and nature, generally speaking. So the day we learn to work with nature, we have a solution moving forward. And the question, Engi, you're asking me, is floating cities a solution? It absolutely is. But again, we need to work with water. Now, if you take the case of Dubai, Dubai has always had a beautiful coastline. It is one of the unique characters of Dubai. But then that coastline is also diminishing. There are pockets I can no longer visit. You cannot build community around those pockets because more and more of it is becoming private. But the solution to that probably is the floating city. And the lessons we can learn is actually lessons of how our ancestors worked with these beautiful natural resources that are so easily available to us. On one hand, in Dubai, land is not scarce. So we might ask this question, then why do we need to have man-made islands or floating city in the context of Dubai? The answer to that is, it is actually our opportunity to actually have much more climate literacy, offer an opportunity for sustainable living. 100% can be done. And that has to be done by looking at how can waste turn into a resource? How can we have solutions which we look at different opportunities of better water management solutions? So honestly, it will only start at the level of an individual. And if that individual is educated, is made aware, we as a community can then start to make a difference. The second point, the benefit, very, very important. When we reclaim land, we completely ruin the marine life. We can have all the reports to say this is what we did to mitigate that, but did we really mitigate is a big question. How can these floating cities look into solutions that they can allow the regeneration of our ecosystems? Because then only is what we are looking at as a way forward. And we have some brilliant examples right through history and even now where this is possible. And what is really important as a third point, it will become a benefit when we stop looking at how can I create a wow out of this floating city. Yes, you want to attract tourism, maybe you want to have that economic benefit, but more than creating that wow factor, can we move and start seeing how through these floating cities can we begin to create better livable communities, as Paul was mentioning, livable densities. Maybe look at having livable communities through who are really climate literate and create a model of sustainable living.
That's interesting, and I'm glad that you touched base on some of that economical feasibility, the environmental consideration. But developers are, let's talk the ugly truth. More than aesthetics, more than the appeal, it's the money. So is it still a beneficial option for developers to consider floating cities, considering the amount of investment that they need to put onto those infrastructure to protect and mitigate their impact? Khalid, have you encountered such experience? Where do you see the benefits lie to a developer to actually be interested and invested in such concepts?
Well, it's the scarcity of land. And when we say land, it's the valuable land. Most of the developers or the master developers that they do cities or large master development, they look for beachfront land. And we know, in Dubai, it's almost no beachfront land. So, and the value of this land, usually it's the most expensive land. And in fact, one of the developers that we're working with now, he is actually starting to think to build, not floating, build reclaimed cities or land next to his existing beachfront land because it's cheaper than his existing beachfront land. So the reclaimed one is cheaper than beachfront land. So I'm sure that with the technologies and with the development that is coming our way, the floating city hopefully would be competing with that. This is one. The second thing is, if I'm a developer and or a master developer who I know that I'm building and a future of a city, and I don't want to block the views for the beachfront land, because this is how it is. Usually you build the reclaimed land on the most important areas of the city. So if I'm a developer and I'm building, I don't want to block the views for the first row, which is already an expensive land. So the floating city would be the solution, where you push away from the beachfront and you let the society who lives in the same beachfront originally enjoy their views without obstacles that we're seeing it in a lot of cases here. So I think because of the scarcity of the valuable land for developers, they will definitely look into that as a future for investment and as an opportunity for their development.
Yeah, I would reckon, and I suppose preserving views, and adding, get premium for the current existing structures, as well as you get the premium for the floating or reclaimed lands, whichever or that they opt for. But I guess, from a planning perspective, there's a lot to be done. And I think we speak about the role of governments and authorities in regulating, existing urban structures and master plans and developments. But when it comes to floating cities, how do we achieve that balance? What do we know that is right? Have we learned the lessons from reclaimed or man-made islands? Perhaps, Cameron, you could shed some insight within, have you seen such governance, or what can authorities do that would really regulate the concepts of floating cities and not just, let them spur out of control?
Great. So let's start with regulators and innovators have a kind of a symbiotic relationship. They both feed off each other, they can both help each other, and it often becomes adversarial, or at least we see it as adversarial. And probably the biggest point I want to make is that we shouldn't have this adversarial relationship between regulators and innovators. We're seeing, for example, in the US, Elon Musk is rallying against regulation. That's where it's become adversarial. It should be symbiotic, and the two can help each other. Regulation at its core should be designed to incentivise and seed a free market. At least we're speaking here in a capitalist market. Regulation should be designed to seed that market, to incentivise innovation. And regulation at its core, the overarching principle, at least in Western capitalist democracies, is that regulation and law should be designed so as to remedy a problem. If there's no problem, we shouldn't be writing rules that might create one. That's probably the starting point. Secondly, I want to talk, the audience, a lot of the audience are going to be aware of this, but who makes laws that regulate coastlines and coastal zones? So just a quick, what we call a Soldiers 5 in the Australian Navy, which is my background. What I'll call the coastline is called in law, it's called the baseline, but I'll just call it the coastline. The coastline out to 12 nautical miles, nation states can assert full sovereignty over this zone. So they can make and enforce their own laws as if it was land, really, is the best way to think about it. That's 0 to 12 miles offshore. 12 to 24 nautical miles, they can assert some sovereignty in certain fields of law, mostly related to immigration, biosecurity, defence, things like that. Most of the Western capitalist democracies will have 2 or 3 levels of government. They'll have national regulators, a national government, a parliament of some sort, who writes laws for that 0 to 12 miles, sometimes state, and then a local or municipal council. And there's going to be a role in regulatory frameworks for the national government, and the local and municipal. And generally, we steer towards local and municipal taking the leadership role in regulation of coastlines. They tend to be a little bit more innovative. Now, I'll deviate there very, very quickly. I know we're talking about floating cities, but I personally don't think that's where floating infrastructure is going to start. I think it's going to be commercial and industrial profit-making enterprises. And I'll use the example of a commercial or deepwater port. Getting big ships into ports is actually extremely difficult. It looks really easy, but you've got to dredge out the bottom, you've got to have minimum depths, there's got to be a lot of supporting infrastructure. If you could put a profit-making port infrastructure some distance offshore and have it transshipped, that's the kind of thing that I think is going to start core floating infrastructure. National regulators, because ports are critical infrastructure, national regulators usually sort of take ownership of them. So, getting down to the core point. I'm from Australia, and colloquially speaking, we are a small government people. We don't like a lot of regulation, we don't like a lot of laws, contrast to, say, the EU, which is very, very heavily regulated. I suggest there are 3 buckets of regulation that we should be focused on, which will incentivise innovation in the space. The first is asking ourselves, what can be built? So what on the water, what sort of floating infrastructure can be built? So this is going to take into account technical and design standards, a lot of human safety, materials, that sort of thing. It is, as you alluded to, first of all, it's wrong to suggest that this is a new field. Human beings have been putting floating things on water for millennia, and we've gotten actually quite good at it. And there are both private and public agencies that can write law and policy that supports this. So the first bucket is what can be built. Second bucket is what can we do on this infrastructure? Can we have trade and commerce? Do we have regular sort of criminal laws? Are there taxation zones, for example? What are people allowed to do on the water as opposed to on land? Is it the same, or could there be some differences? And there's a big market for some taxation differences, for trade and commerce zones, for example, depending on how far you sit from the coast and whose laws apply. By the way, beyond 200 nautical miles from the coast, it's wrong to say that no laws apply, but no state can assert sovereignty over that zone. So you in some ways, you have quite a bit more freedom out there. The final bucket of law, so what can be built, what can we do on it? And the final bucket of law is how do we mitigate the negative consequences? Now that's going to be probably start with environmental. There's a lot we could say. I don't have enough time to say it all, but how do we mitigate environmental risks? And floating cities are a heck of a lot better than reclaimed land, but we'll move on. How can we mitigate safety risks? So just like any floating vessel, it needs to be safe for humans to occupy that space. Then there can be some sort of social risks that would have to mitigate. As soon as you take a group of people and put them in a slightly more isolated environment, it can become, don't read too much into this, but criminal activity can flourish. You know, we need to make sure that we look after the social risks of having a city that is a bit removed from the rest of society. So generally speaking, those are the three buckets of law I think we should make, but I hope the audience can walk away with the viewpoint that regulation should incentivise the industry, not be a handbrake on it. And secondly, that regulation should remedy a problem that already exists. In English law, they called it remedying mischief. If the problem doesn't exist, we should let the market move ahead.
Yeah, absolutely, and I like the fact that you've started to touch base beyond, you know, the necessities within an infrastructure, like you know, beyond food access and energy and water and all of that. Like, what other critical elements do you think, Dr. Harpreet, should also be considered as part of a design or an engineering exercise?
Right. I think I'm a people's person. So for me, I think community comes right at the top. So who are we building these floating cities or the infrastructure or anything for is actually that end user, is the person who's going to be living there. And building that community is so important anywhere beyond land or in the water. It doesn't really matter. But in this case, I think it becomes even more important because you want to see what are those means and what are those design strategies that you could employ to have better integration between the people on land and on sea, but also how can you actually encourage more interaction and sharing, maybe have communal farms on this floating city, which we are beginning to see less and less of, which is so unfortunate. People talk about human-centric cities and all of that, but are we really interacting and sharing is a big question. I've seen Dubai grow, and I'm beginning to feel that Dubai is also becoming a place where we are all living in silos, like quite a few developed parts of the world. So once you're in that silo, you're comfortable in that silo, and you really don't move out of that silo. So community is a big one. The second one, I think, which is really important when you're looking at these initial planning stages is connectivity. What kind of a connectivity is there so that there is no feeling of being segregated, so as to say, from, say, the mainland. And I think that needs to be done right at the initial stages of planning itself. And it's important that all the stakeholders have a voice. If that doesn't happen, then we're going to have a failed model. Additionally, the fourth one, which I think which is extremely important, is how do we make it affordable? Our world is becoming more and more about the haves and the have-nots. Who's going to address the have-nots, right? So it's important that what we are thinking of building in the very near future is affordable, is accessible to everybody, irrespective of their age, irrespective of their financial status, irrespective of their ability. Because if we don't do that, then we've really failed. And we're setting up for failure.
Yeah, correct. Absolutely correct. And it's not just about the affordability, but also I think the livability, as you said, touching on that social aspect. What was, or at least what's happening around the world right now, and I think the people of Dubai would resonate with this, is that we live in siloed communities on land. So the moment we start pushing ourselves out, towards the coast and the sea, I only reckon that if we really don't think about, that social connectivity, and the way that the critical infrastructure, is all blended in a way that, allows that kind of secure, livable, affordable city, whether on land or as a floating city or an island. You don't want to feel like you're in silo. So absolutely, and I think that's the role of the master planners, perhaps, and the designers to allow that connectivity. So from that angle, how do you see yourself, like if you are now given a floating city, what kind of considerations would you put in at your forefront?
I think the first thing that we would do is, from principle, is to try to make it feels like home. And I think this is the value. And this would attract a lot of people to live in such a city, which is if it feels like home. Recently, I visited Venice, and I know it's not a floating city, but I think it gives the water living experience. The gondolier there, the gondolier is the man who drives boats. He is not only a man who drives boat, he is a storyteller, he is a cultural guru there, and there is a reason there is a reason why he is considered as a cultural man within that city, is because there's no cars in that city. And there's a lot of beautiful experiences that is human-centric, and it feels like home. So the two things that I would do in order to have the floating cities feels like home is, first, I think, back to the governance. I think it has to cater for all type of families, all type of people. It has to have laws. It's a proper cities. We shouldn't only cater this floating cities for early adopters or exclusive kind of people. It should adapt for all of you, all the families. Second is, from design perspective, and this is what I've learned throughout my architecture career, that people look for comfortable things, comfortable life, something that we can relate to. So we shouldn't design floating cities as, I know that it's extraordinary concept, but it shouldn't feel like extraordinary concept. It should feel like a normal city with a lot of grounded feeling and comfortable and stability for people who live there. And it should feel like you're walking in a park, but it happened to be in a floating city. You can go to your cafe, you can walk with your dog and see kids playing and so on. So it's an experiment, but it shouldn't feel like an experiment. It should feel like a livable city. And this is how I think it can, if we follow these principles, I think this would lead us to make it feel like home.
Yes, I agree. And I think even going back to basics is key to future developments. Again, thinking about how can we integrate passive design? How do we apply the tools that we've got in hand? Like right now, we're talking about, we've got the smart systems, we've got certain technological advancement that allow for thermal comfort and us monitoring environmental impact and the sort. So I think, yes, it's functional, it's feasible, it's viable, but there are certain thoughts that needs to come into play because, again, we are given a clean slate, but it's not a random clean slate. It's one that affects ecosystems that are around it, right? So, and I think this is why till now we are still just talking about concepts of floating cities. We haven't yet seen a fully built, functional floating city, apart from that from 4,000 years ago. But it's because it didn't need all the infrastructure that we currently have in place now. The density is different, etc. So going back to you, Cameron, you mentioned something very interesting there, which is you see the future starting off with the industrial sector, the marine. And not far from here, we've got the Neum Oxygen, which is the first floating industrial city as a concept still, that is taking shape. Now, whether it would be successful or not, we're yet to see, but perhaps because of the function behind it, behind that concept, it would serve as a benchmark to floating cities within this region. Where do you see as a learning curve or from those successful concepts, whether they were close to being implemented or not, that current developers could take into consideration?
Yeah, thanks. So I think a couple of preconditions have to be met before floating infrastructure is going to become widespread. We're probably at the tipping point now where the value of coastal land, for one of many purposes, is high enough, and the cost of materials engineering to create buoyant structures is going downwards. And where these two lines cross, that's going to be that tipping point to where it is commercially feasible. And that's the first prerequisite. It has to be commercially feasible, otherwise a free market's not going to do it. The second point, I think Roland will probably speak to this more, is the technical feasibility. And what I'll use this little bit to talk about is why the Middle East is a fantastic incubator for this sort of technical feasibility. I'm not an engineer or anything, but we need to be in a zone with relatively stable weather, so not prone to significant revolving storms, not prone to unpredictable weather. We need a stable troposphere that exists here. We need to be, generally speaking, within about, the prime zones would be in about 10 degrees of the equator, so that's going to be areas like Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Thailand, we've got like Hawaii, the Caribbean, and some parts of the Mediterranean are quite stable as well. Inside 10 degrees either side of the equator, there's not enough Coriolis force to generate a tropical revolving storm, so that's going to be quite important. We need a deep water depth, but not too deep. So something like 20 to 100 metres is about ideal. We need a warm sea surface temperature, but not consistently above 28 degrees, because that's where you get evaporation sufficient to generate a low pressure zone and create storms. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit, but the Middle East actually has all of those factors present. The Arabian Gulf is a warm climate with warm sea surface temperature, very stable troposphere, very little upper level divergence, stable weather, and biggest of all, like an appetite for big ideas, and that's why it's going to work here. So to summarise, we need the commercial aspects to make sense, which is why I think floating infrastructure will start off as profit-making enterprises, probably in commercial or industrial settings rather than purely residential. And by the way, humans have been doing that for thousands of years, fish farming and all sorts of things floating on the water. Then we need the meteorological, oceanographic conditions to be right. And the third thing we sort of need is a demand, and that is a coastline where land supply is exhausted, where there is big demand for coastal land, but there's no more supply. That could come from residential, but I suspect it's more likely to start in industrial and commercial kind of zones, like, for example, the port of Singapore. That land is absolutely maxed out, trade is growing. Where else can we put floating cranes storage for thousands of containers? And I would suggest on the water is an extremely viable option.
Roland, would you like to add to what Cameron was saying from that technical and feasible engineering concepts, perhaps?
Yeah, so I'm not a marine engineer, first of all. I had a little bit of experience in floating structures in a previous career. they're quite unforgiving. So obviously the solutions for any kind of structure that's going to constantly be undergoing flexion, material fatigue, that's obviously going to be a big solution for the engineers here to design for. What I would be more concerned about is, the marine environment is very different from the terrestrial environment. It reacts in a way that is completely unique to a terrestrial construction environment. If you are putting anything into the water, it's going to give you something back. So a good example is if you're going to build on the coastline here in Dubai, you are going to have to build a coastal shelter in order to, protect from the relatively minor storm events that you have here, but they're still going to be required. We have examples in the past where a floating structure was accidentally left out, I think after New Year's, which some people may be aware of, and the impact of a storm that came in was very evident straight afterwards. The structure did not survive. So you're going to have to put that protective structure in place. You're likely then going to have a restricted water flow. So then you've got the risk of all this infrastructure you're putting with a floating city on top runs the risk of introducing nutrients. If you have poor waste management, whether by the occupants or by the waste removal systems, you're going to be introducing nutrients into the water, which can result in algal blooms. We've seen those, we've heard about them if we've lived here long enough. They can then cause all sorts of environmental issues as well. So all of these kind of things have to be assessed very early on in the planning. And to what Paul said at the start in his introduction, apply the science. So it's critical with these projects for their success to consult the relevant scientists and the science in this area very, very early on in the design. So pre-concept, early visioning, speak to the people who understand the marine system the best. I know we often go for, obviously, the design on paper that looks very impressive and sells, and this is obviously important in our industry, but it has to be practical as well. Too often we come in and we design for these solutions way later in the phases, maybe after concept into schematic. We start to look at the environmental constraints, and that's when you're going to have the hardest time to actually have an influence over it. You might have to change the design, and then it's abortive work and so on.
Yeah, I agree, and I'll add to that perhaps even the user experience, if you take it as a journey, like from the land all the way to, the floating city, and then how they interact within the city itself needs to be planned for and thought of from day one. I believe just similar to our concepts of asset management, like how do we apply successful operations and facility managements for those floating islands and structures? What kind of considerations, like from a preventative maintenance point of view? And I think this is where a lot of the technologies, that are currently being developed would come into play. Interestingly, I recall just quite recently, we've done an urban model for one of, it's a reclaimed land on the sea, on the forefront. I'm not going to mention where, but it's in the UAE. And our findings and observations that they were building this billion-dollar development, right? And when we did the model and the environmental predictions based on climate change, the whole development that they're doing is actually going to sink in 30 years. So to even, we have the tools to know whether this area is susceptible to any environmental constraints or climate change. But even though we have told that developer, look, you need to stop right now because you're literally flushing down your money and any investor's money that will come into play. And you need to start thinking about the environmental risk and how you're going to mitigate it. But they decided to just ignore us and go ahead. So good luck to whoever's going to buy it. Definitely not me. So going back to your own and from an environmental point of view and that risk and mitigation idea or notion, where do you see the main risks lie, and how can we actually mitigate for environmental and climate change?
Well, what I would say is, so there are risks, but there are also opportunities. So the risks are when you don't factor in the potential things that can go wrong, the externalities of a project like this. But if you get in there early and you factor these in, so you have proper waste management, you have proper systems to allow for, if there is a disconnection of an automated waste management system, pumping out liquid waste, you want to have a system that shuts off very early, responds to it. These all exist. So bunkering operations in offshore, you'll be very aware with this. These systems exist already. So just apply existing systems there smartly, and you can solve those engineering problems. In terms of the natural environment, what I would say the biggest risk is site selection. So where you're going to build these, especially in a coastal area, like an unsheltered coastal area like we have in Dubai, you want to make sure you're picking an area that is perhaps of least concern when it comes to the habitat that's present there. And then you've got an opportunity to actually create something out of what might be relatively low in terms of its ecosystem services. So no habitats are valueless, but some habitats obviously are more valuable than others. So you can add things in. So when you build your coastal protection structures, you can design those in such a way to really promote coral recruitment. So you can create reefs where previously there was nothing suitable for a reef to establish. You can come up with innovative solutions to clean the water of the nutrients we talked about. Dubai coastline has elevated nutrient levels, so it's very close at any time to triggering an algal bloom under the right conditions, summer temperatures, stagnant waters. You can introduce things like floating reed beds, you can introduce floating oyster farms, as long as you're maintaining them properly and removing the organic matter. You can actually clean the water of your system and at the same time create something visually appealing that actually enhances your project. So again, it's about incorporating these into the design very early on in a smart way, in an innovative way that solves the problem and adds value to the project as well, even just from an aesthetic perspective. Okay. So there's so many ways, but again, I could go on for hours on this, and I would love to speak to anybody here that wants to talk more about this at length. But again, I'll just bring it back to my message, which is get people who know these kinds of things involved as early as possible in your design.
Absolutely.
That's the number one message I'd like to share today.
Well said. And what do you think from a resilience or point of view? And I'll have this as an open question to the whole panel, but perhaps Cameron, you could start that discussion from a resilience and critical infrastructure future proofing. Where do you think, or what do you think should be done or taken into consideration?
Yeah, well, I'd probably go back to what I said before, in that those two factors have to be present for floating infrastructure to thrive. It has to be commercially feasible and site selection, exactly as Roland said. What I would say, and certainly not to take a contrary position to Roland, but to amplify what he's saying, we certainly the Floating Institute, we believe that for every problem there is a solution. And a lot of the problems that are highlighted with floating infrastructure, well, actually, first of all, I'll say there is a reason that we haven't done this yet. There is a reason that human beings have been living on coast for 60,000 years, and so far we haven't built anything significant on the water. There are obviously reasons for this, but we're reaching the point in human evolution now where we can come up with solutions. Meteorological and oceanographic factors can be mitigated. A lot of the physical effects of a tropical storm, for example, affect similar things on land as what they do on water. But on water, we have a significant benefit. There are two primary forces that act on any floating object. That's the first force of gravity downwards and the force of buoyancy upwards. And we can actually adjust that ratio with mass. Not so much talking about a floating city here, but floating infrastructure. In the event of a significant storm, you can ballast it. You can actually sink it deeper. And with non-sensitive infrastructure, you can actually sink it below the waves. A massive barge for a port or something, you can actually just sink it down below and let the storm go overhead, wind, waves and such, and then raise it back up later on. And that's an example of this sort of resilience. Floating infrastructure is also mobile. Some of it will be anchored to the seabed, but it can be detached. We see this in oil and gas fields. And in the interest of letting other people speak, I'll leave hopefully the audience with one thought. A lot of you are over 40. I'm not going to ask you to identify yourselves. When you were born, I just capture this in your head. When you were born, there was no such thing as a computer. And I just, like maybe as you walk away, let that sink in. 40 years ago, There was no such thing as a computer. Look how far we have come in 40 years as a species. When we first started exploiting offshore resources, it was only about 100 years ago, and we were limited to basically water you could almost stand in. Only 40 years ago, no longer did that structure have to be anchored to the seafloor. We went from exploiting oil fields in 40 metres depth to 4,000. This is all happening in the blink of an eye. And so just remember, with any problem, technical or engineering, 40 years ago, there was no such thing as a computer.
Yes. And even from, I mean, I'll add to that, the tools are there for us to think out of the box when it comes to structural integrity, stormwater management, waste management, and the like. We even have now the 3D printing and 3D printing like precast and all of those construction methods that would eliminate a lot of the environmental impacts from constructing on the sea that we currently are witnessing at reclaimed land. So we can utilize the new trends that are coming up now for us to kind of predict and prevent, as well as ensure resiliency. Would any of the other panelists like to share any thoughts on the topic?
I think I just want to add one thing, just kind of building up on the conversation with Cameron. I think technology is good, advancement is good, but we also need to be very cautious and be very aware of the fact that when we look into concepts such as floating cities, we don't think of it as building on water, but how can we actually build with water? They're completely two different approaches and ideas of being with water and then being very cautious in saying, yeah, we actually building with water, but who are we building it for? We're building it for people and everything that is living on the surface or under the surface of the water. That's so important, because I feel sometimes it's the experts who have these conversations like we are today, but there's so many voices which will never appear in this room, right? So those voices also need to be heard through these experts, being sensitive to the needs and the requirements of people who cannot be in a room such as we are privileged to be here today.
Yes, well said, Dr. Harpreet. So yeah, as a closing or concluding, I mean, we can go on and on with this, but I think we need to think about the future of such cities, link them up even as part of our strategy for urban planning, our decarbonization roadmaps. Like how do you ensure that we're not adding additional carbon footprint because of those floating cities? That we are indeed actually saving energy, we are saving marine life, we are not harming the ecosystem that lies above or under the ground.
So thank you, Engi. Wonderful panel session. We could do with a bit more of it, but I wish we could. Please, huge round of applause for our panel. Thank you so much. Thank you.